Good evening, young kindred. Well, first of all, let me say, kick the mud from your boots and the city from your coat, and sit down and attempt in some way to be civilized. We are, after all, thoroughly civilized here, if nothing else. Where are my terrible manners? Mortimer Gresham, at your service. I am something of a chronicler, historian, if you will, of the vast metropolis in which we find ourselves, and I'm led to understand that you're new to these nights, so I said that I would more than likely be the person to instruct you in what has come before, the importance of the cobblestone streets and wide vistas where you find yourself. For in truth, though clearly not native born to the city, Dublin is strange. It itself is not native born to this island, so in many ways we are all expatriates here of one form or another. Very few who are here now were here when it began, and I cannot say if any would truly know the truth. Ancients may claim to have knowledge that has fallen through the cracks. However, well, between you and I, neonate, we must take that with a pinch of salt. Now then, where shall we begin? I suppose it's fair to say that Dublin began with the Vikings. They were, after all, the ones who built this, hmm, the beginnings of our story, into a trading post that then became a thriving metropolis. They used it to raid and pillage, sack and terrorize the surrounding countryside, but, well, that is the Vikings for you. They tended to settle, however, and where they did, they built towns and communities. Dublin was one such. Indeed, eventually, it formed into the nucleus around which the entire nation of Ireland would eventually grow. However, our kind have been interlaced with it since the beginning. I'm led to understand that in the dark bastions of time, powerful Jarl kings ruled from Dublin, who wore great gilded crowns of stolen gold taken from churches upon their head, twisted things of dragon's fire and Nordic memory. However, eventually, as with all things, there comes a mellowing of self. One can only be the resolute pagan for so long, and as Ireland became more and more gripped by the religion of the one true God, as the bells started to toll, the various different supernatural creatures that inhabited the darkness slank away from the power of the Almighty Christ. Indeed, so too times changed within Dublin. That was when the sanctified took up their rulership, and indeed, through many centuries, they have proven to be wise, capable leaders who led the spiritual and the faithful of the city into a golden age. The Pax Lancaeum, if you will. However, not everything can, as we all know, last forever. But the sanctified, for their part, built many great bastions of their power on many potentially powerful mystical sites, and they used those places to enact their works of the Lord. They brought civilization to the wilderness. After all, the island of Ireland was at one point known as the island of saints and scholars, and one can truly see the hands of the Lancea et Sanctum behind this movement. The church does tend to like to build order where it can. Even the Invictus, who cling to their cling to their notions of noblesse oblige, must unfortunately infight with one another, the houses constantly struggling. However, when you're united with the belief in the one true God, I tend to find that it creates less ardent fisticuffs. Wouldn't you agree, Neonate? Ah, yes, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, we have a city that stands beautiful and bright on the periphery of the known world, surrounded by monasteries, culture, and the ability to grow. All the way through the subjugation by the British, the Lancair ruled quietly. After all, they didn't really see the point in gaudy displays of power, and kindred was sated for blood and had the long nights to while away. So one after another the cardinals would rise, eventually falling again into torpor, and so the cycle moved. Occasionally, of course, there were insurrections and rebellions, but none were ever capable of thwarting the Lancair in their own home. You understand. I will now discuss a gentleman whose name still has heavy connotations here. Mm. A gentleman by the name of Thomas Newport. Thomas was one of the brightest kindred whom I have ever had the pleasure of knowing, neonate. He was a member of Clan Nosferatu, but despite his advanced years, for he was embraced, oh my, he was embraced when, shortly after the rising of the Jacobites. I'm led to understand that in life he was a cavalier and a chevalier, but that is neither here nor there. Newport rose to be the Cardinal of Dublin in the year of our Lord 1895, and he was a good man. Now, you might need clarification on what that means. It means that he never allowed himself to be subsumed by his beast. Indeed, despite his advanced age, it is said that not even the curse of the Nosferatu gripped him. If he was a member of any of the lines of blood that have become so commonplace in the modern nights, I really couldn't say. But he did not show his bestial side. He did not seem wrong. As a matter of fact, he seemed quite pastoral. One could say that in the night so filled with horrors, he was a good man. And yes, neonate, he was my friend. I still miss him to this day. However, during his long praxis, the city flourished. Independence was declared. A nation rose from a broken state, and there was peace and contentment. That is until it started to happen. It started innocuously enough, if truth is to be told. Several kindred falling to dreams, strange portents locked in their mind's eye. These things are innocuous enough, in truth, and most of them bear no real credibility. However, night after night, the kindred of Dublin began to see signs, strange, unearthly signs, that harrowed their dreams. In truth, I cannot say if these portents spoke of some greater malice, but they saw a bright crimson eye that blazed with unearthly, inhuman luminescence, and heard the sound of drums that seemed to beat into their very blood. For 12 long nights these visions lasted, continuing and continuing, until eventually, on the 12th day, you were going to think that I said night. No, no, in truth, not. On the 12th day, as the clocks were about to strike noon, a great shadow roiled, as it seemed as though the sun itself had been set behind a fist that gripped it. There was night in day. Now, eclipses are not uncommon solar events. We all know this. We are beings of logic as well as the mystical, as I'm sure you understand. However, this eclipse had come from nowhere. It had never been in any way spoken of. It was not expected. And then we all felt a tugging, as if something in the blood was pulling us slowly. It felt unearthly. The kindred rose during this black night, during the day, and witnessed the truth of it all. The eclipse lasted for several hours, eventually ceasing just in time for the individuals of Dublin to see, well, the sunset. And then, as if we were in some vile fairy tale, there was a smoting upon the door of St. Patrick's Cathedral, the seat of the Lancashire power within Dublin. Once it smote, twice it smote, 3 times, until the door appeared like it would crack in, like an egg that had a fingertip placed upon it and pressed down. And standing there, outside, in regalia completely unknown to us, seen to be crafted from the blood itself, there stood a single individual with the baleful crimson eye etched into his forehead. He spoke in a voice that not only commanded respect, but seemed to suggest that those who would not give it would be damned for their lack of manners. He said in the Celtic tongue, well, he said the time had come, that he had slept long, thinking that this obsession with the one true God would simply fizzle away, turn to nothing but ash. My, how wrong he was. And so now that he had awoken from his slumbers, he intended to do something in order to remedy the situation. Newport went out to confront this individual, this bygone spirit. And the good man met the monster who had named itself Baelor. For those of you who do not know, Baelor was the king of the Fomorians, a figment of terrible wrath in the imaginings of the Celtic Irish. Newport summoned all the powers of God to him and struck at Baelor with holy fire, tried to drive him away with the warding signs. And this monster simply stood there and laughed. He turned the holy fire to snakes and rats and other vermin with a flick of his wrist. He grasped Cardinal Newport by the throat, and with one wave of his hand, and a sword that seemed to be conjured from brambles and fire, he struck the cardinal's head from his shoulders, whilst the city watched on. He then said that any whom opposed him would meet a very similar fate, even as the body of my friend turned to dust at his feet. I wish there had been another way, and I wish that Newport had not engaged this demon in kindred flesh. And that, my children, was 10 long years ago. Baelor crowned himself as High King of Dublin, and has ruled ever since, though ruled is not necessarily right. He does not lead in the same way that one would think a prince proper would. He tends to delegate most of the tasks to other kindred, preferring his sorcerous workings and his time spent in other places. I am led to understand that these realms are but our own, but are not of it, a complicated morass of dreams. Reality. In truth, the other covenants mostly keep to themselves, occasionally called together by either the whim of the prince or his stated seneschal, who rules mostly unquestioned. And that, my darling neonate, is where we find ourselves. I welcome you to your nights in Dublin. I hope it is that you will find here what it is that you're looking for. Maybe your own truth. Who can say? May the blessings of Longinus be upon you, and may he keep you safe from the long night.